The wind howled through the broken window of Josephine Shaw's tiny farmhouse like a banshee announcing death's arrival. But the real tragedy had arrived 3 weeks earlier when her husband vanished with their life savings, leaving nothing but a hastily scrawled note and a mountain of debt behind. Spring of 1872 had brought no renewal to Julian, California, only bitter disappointment as the gold that once drew dreamers to this mountain settlement seemed as elusive as happiness now was for the young widow who wasn't truly a widow at all. Josephine Josie, to those who had once called her friend, stared at the meager pile of coins on her kitchen table, proceeds from selling her wedding ring. 26 years old and already discarded, she pushed a strand of auburn hair behind her ear and tried to quiet the trembling in her hands. The knocking at her door startled her. Visitors had become rare since Thomas left. The whole town had turned its back on her, whispering that she must have driven him away, that no decent man abandons his wife without cause. Mrs. Shaw. The banker, Mr. Whitfield, stood on her porch, his round face pinched with what might have been sympathy if it wasn't overshadowed by business. "I've come about the mortgage." "I know what you've come about," Josie said, straightening her shoulders despite the weariness that had settled into her bones. "I'll have your payment by the end of the week. I'm afraid that won't do." He cleared his throat, uncomfortable but resolute. "The bank is for closing." "With your husband gone and no means to pay, I have means," she interrupted, her voice stronger than she felt. "A woman alone can't run this farm. Be reasonable, Mrs. Shaw." His tone softened, patronizing now. "Your brother-in-law has offered to take you in. It's the sensible choice." Sensible. As if living under Simon Shaw's roof, bearing his leering looks and enduring his wife's thinly veiled contempt was sensible. As if abandoning the home she had built with her own hands alongside a man she had foolishly loved was sensible. "I'll have your payment," she repeated, closing the door on him before tears could betray her. Alone again, Josie sank into a chair, the silence of the house pressing in on her. Thomas had left just before planting season, and now the fields lay barren. She had attempted to plow herself, resulting in blistered hands and barely a quarter-acre turned. The cows needed milking, the chickens tending, and the roof had begun to leak during the last storm. Work that had once been shared between two now fell solely to her, and whispers around town said she'd be gone before summer's end. She had no one left. Her parents had died in a typhoid outbreak years before. Her friends, if she could call them that, had turned away one by one. Even the pastor's wife, once quick with an invitation to Sunday socials, now averted her gaze after church. Thomas's betrayal had somehow marked Josie as an outcast, the abandoned wife who must have deserved her fate. The next morning dawned cold and clear. Josie rose before the sun, as had been her habit since marrying Thomas 5 years ago. The familiar routine of feeding chickens and milking cows brought little comfort, but it was something to occupy her hands while her mind churned with worries. She needed help with spring planting, but she had no money to hire hands, and the townspeople who might have once assisted a neighbor in need now pretended not to see her. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention from the chicken coop. A rider approached, his silhouette unfamiliar against the rising sun. Josie straightened, brushing feed from her apron as the stranger came into view. He rode a dappled gray horse, his tall frame easy in the saddle. As he drew closer, she could make out the features of a man perhaps 30 years of age, his face weathered by sun and wind, dark hair visible beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He reined his horse to a stop at her fence line. "Morning, madam," he called, his voice deep but gentle. "Hope I'm not intruding." "What can I do for you?" Josie asked, wary of strangers after Thomas's departure had left her vulnerable. "Name's Henry Dawson," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Passing through and looking for work. Heard in town you might need help with spring planting." Josie nearly laughed at the absurdity. "Who in town told you that? The same people who won't look me in the eye anymore." A small smile crossed his face, creasing the corners of eyes the color of a summer sky. "Overheard it at the saloon. Talk travels." "I can't pay," she said bluntly. "So whatever you heard, it won't profit you to stop here." Henry Dawson dismounted, his movements fluid despite his height. "Madam, I didn't ask about payment." He looked around the farm, taking in the untended fields and sagging fence. "I'm between destinations, need somewhere to rest a spell. Thought maybe we could help each other." "I don't need charity," Josie said, pride stiffening her spine, not offering any. He leaned against the fence, casual but respectful of the boundary between them. "Offering labor in exchange for a place to sleep in your barn and whatever food you can spare. I'm handy with tools, good with animals, and I know farming." Josie hesitated. Having a strange man on her property could damage what little remained of her reputation, but the alternative was losing everything. "For how long? Until planting's done, then we'll reassess." She studied him, searching for signs of deception or threat. His clothes were worn but clean, his manner straightforward. There was something in his eyes, a steadiness, perhaps, that made her want to trust him despite everything experience had taught her about trusting men. "The barn's not much," she finally said, "and food's simple. Simple suits me fine." He smiled again, this time reaching his eyes. That evening, after Henry had spent the day repairing fence posts and clearing rocks from the south field, they sat at her kitchen table sharing a modest supper of cornbread and bean stew. He ate with appreciation but not greed and spoke little unless prompted. Josie found the silence oddly comfortable after weeks of nothing but her own thoughts for company. "How long has your husband been gone?" he asked suddenly, then immediately raised a hand. "Forgive me, not my business." Josie stared into her bowl. 3 weeks, left a note saying he'd found another opportunity, took our savings. She hadn't meant to share so much, but the words spilled out like water through a broken dam. "The bank's foreclosing, I have until the end of the month." Henry nodded, absorbing this information without judgment. "The field we cleared today good for corn, could have it planted by week's end if weather holds." "Won't be enough," she said quietly. "Even if I could harvest a crop, it would be months away. The bank wants their money now." "One problem at a time," Henry replied, his voice carrying a certainty that almost made her believe. "Fields first, then we'll figure out the bank." That night, lying in her bed listening to the distant sounds of Henry settling into the barn, Josie allowed herself a dangerous sliver of hope. She had become accustomed to carrying her burdens alone, to expecting nothing but further disappointment. The presence of someone willing to help even temporarily felt like the first rain after a long drought. Over the next week, Henry proved himself a tireless worker. He rose before Josie each morning, already tending to animals by the time she stepped outside. The south field was plowed, fertilized, and planted with corn seed they'd found stored in the barn. He repaired the leaking roof, fixed the broken window, and reinforced the chicken coop against predators. They fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side during daylight hours, sharing quiet meals in the evening. Josie found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, the sure movements of his hands, the concentration in his expression as he worked, the rare but transformative smile that occasionally crossed his face. She caught herself wondering about his past, what had shaped him into this silent, capable man who asked for so little and gave so much. On Sunday, Josie dressed for church as usual, though the prospect of facing the town's judgment had become even more daunting with Henry's presence on her farm. "You're welcome to come," she offered as she pinned her hat in place, though part of her hoped he would decline. Explaining a strange man to the gossips of Julian was not a conversation she looked forward to. "Think I'll stay and finish that north fence," Henry replied. Not much for crowds these days. Relief mingled with a strange disappointment as Josie nodded and headed toward town alone. The church service proceeded as it had for the past 3 weeks, with sidelong glances and whispered comments just loud enough for her to hear. She sat alone in the back pew, chin held high despite the ache of isolation. Afterward, as she attempted to slip away without engaging anyone, Mrs. Whitfield, the banker's wife, stepped directly into her path. "Josephine," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I understand you've taken in a drifter. The whole town is talking about it." Josie felt heat rise to her face. "Mr. Dawson is helping with the spring planting in exchange for lodging in the barn. There's nothing improper about it." "Of course not, Mrs. Whitfield replied, her tone suggesting exactly the opposite. "Though one wonders what your husband would think if he returned to find another man living on his property. If Thomas returns, he's welcome to ask Mr. Dawson himself," Josie said evenly. "Until then, I'll make decisions about my farm as I see fit." "Your farm?" Mrs. Whitfield's eyebrows rose. "My husband says the bank will own it soon enough. Perhaps you should consider Simon's offer while it still stands." "Good day, Mrs. Whitfield," Josie managed, brushing past the woman before anger could loosen her tongue further. She walked home with quick steps, frustration burning in her chest. The sight of her farm coming into view calmed her somewhat. Henry had indeed repaired the north fence, and the property already looked more cared for than it had in months, even when Thomas was still there. Henry looked up from splitting wood as she approached, immediately setting down his axe. "Church let out early." "I left early," Josie admitted. She hesitated, then added, "The town's talking about you being here." A shadow crossed his face. "Bringing you trouble, am I? They'd talk regardless." She attempted a smile. "At least now they have something new to discuss besides my failure as a wife." Henry frowned. "A man leaving doesn't make you a failure." "In Julian, it does." Josie sighed, untying her bonnet. "Thank you for fixing the fence." He nodded, clearly sensing her desire to change the subject. "Thought I might look at that creek bed tomorrow. Could divert some water for irrigation if we build a proper channel." "We," she repeated softly, the word unfamiliar after weeks of solitary struggle. That night, unable to sleep, Josie slipped outside to sit on her porch steps. The spring air was cool but not uncomfortable, the sky ablaze with stars. She heard Henry's footsteps before she saw him, emerging from the barn with a blanket in hand. "Thought you might be cold," he said, offering it to her. "Thank you." She wrapped it around her shoulders, the wool carrying a faint scent of hay and leather. "Couldn't sleep." "Don't need much sleep," he said, settling beside her but leaving a respectful distance between them. "Beautiful night." They sat in companionable silence, gazing at the stars. Josie found herself wondering again about this man who had appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared to voice. "Where are you from, Mr. Dawson?" she finally asked. "Henry," he corrected gently. "Born in Missouri, been moving west since the war ended. You fought." He nodded, his face momentarily haunted by memories she could not see. "Union cavalry, spent most of my time chasing raiders in Kansas. And after, he seemed to weigh his words carefully. After, I found it hard to settle, worked ranches in Colorado, mines in Nevada. Drifted where work took me. And what brought you to Julian?" A small smile touched his lips. "Heard there was gold, found something else instead." The way he looked at her then made Josie's heart beat faster, and she quickly turned her gaze back to the stars. "Thomas always said the real gold in Julian was in selling supplies to miners, not in mining itself. He had plans to open a store." She paused, the familiar pain of betrayal washing over her. "I suppose he found a better opportunity elsewhere." "His loss," Henry said quietly. The simple statement, spoken with such conviction, brought unexpected tears to Josie's eyes. She blinked them away, unwilling to appear weak. "We should both get some rest. Morning comes early." "That it does." Henry stood, hesitating before adding, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Shaw, any man who'd leave you behind isn't worth mourning." Josie watched him walk back to the barn, his tall figure silvered by moonlight, and wondered how a stranger could see worth in her that her own husband had not. The following days brought steady progress on the farm. Together, they planted the north field with wheat, repaired the chicken coop roof, and built an irrigation channel from the creek. Each accomplishment, however small, felt like a victory against the odds that seemed stacked against her. Yet the looming bank deadline cast a shadow over their efforts. On Thursday afternoon, as they worked side by side in the vegetable garden behind the house, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Banker Whitfield rode at the head of a small procession that included Simon Shaw, Thomas's older brother, and two other men Josie recognized as members of the town council. Henry straightened beside her, instinctively moving slightly in front of Josie as the men dismounted. The protective gesture wasn't lost on her, nor apparently on Simon, whose eyes narrowed at the sight. "Mrs. Shaw," Whitfield began formally, "we've come to discuss the matter of your property." "I still have a week before your deadline," Josie said, removing her gardening gloves slowly to hide the trembling of her hands. "Circumstances have changed," Whitfield replied. He gestured to Simon. "Mr. Shaw has made a generous offer to settle your husband's debts and take possession of the property." Simon stepped forward, his resemblance to Thomas striking but for the coldness in his eyes that Thomas had always managed to disguise. "It's the sensible solution, Josie. You'll have a place with Martha and me, as family should. No need for you to take in help." His gaze flicked dismissively to Henry. "The farm is mine," Josie said, standing her ground despite the fear coursing through her. "Thomas may have left, but I haven't. I've been making improvements, and I'll have your payment by the deadline." Whitfield exchanged glances with the town councilmen. "Mrs. Shaw, be reasonable. How do you propose to pay? You've no crop to sell, no livestock beyond a few chickens and 2 milk cows." "That's my concern," Josie insisted. "Actually," Simon interjected, "it's mine as well. As Thomas's brother, I have a right to protect family property, especially when my sister-in-law is clearly being taken advantage of by drifters." He stared pointedly at Henry, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Henry's expression remained impassive, but Josie saw his jaw tighten. "Mr. Dawson is a hired hand, nothing more," she said quickly. "Hired with what money?" Simon challenged. "The money my brother took, or are you paying him in other ways?" The crude implication hung in the air like a thundercloud. Josie felt her face flush with anger and humiliation. Before she could respond, Henry finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "You owe the lady an apology," Simon sneered. "I don't owe anything to a woman who dishonors my brother's name by taking up with the first saddle tramp who wanders by." What happened next occurred so quickly Josie barely had time to register it. Henry moved forward, his hand closing around Simon's collar, lifting the shorter man slightly off his feet. "Apologize," he said, each syllable precise and dangerous. The councilmen stepped back, startled by the sudden violence. Whitfield sputtered in protest but made no move to intervene. Simon's face reddened, his hands scrabbling at Henry's grip. "Henry, don't," Josie pleaded, touching his arm. "Please, it isn't worth it." For a moment she thought he wouldn't listen, that the quiet man who had been so gentle around her would reveal a different nature entirely. Then slowly he released Simon, who stumbled backward, gasping and straightening his collar. "Get off my land," Josie said to the assembled men, her voice steadier than she felt. "All of you. I have until the end of the month, and I'll have your money by then." "This isn't over," Simon spat, but he retreated to his horse nonetheless. That man just made a powerful enemy. They watched in tense silence as the men rode away. When they were out of sight, Josie turned to Henry, concern etched on her face. "That was foolish. Simon has influence in this town." "Man needed teaching," Henry replied, though he looked troubled. "I apologize if I've made things worse for you." Josie sighed, the brief surge of strength leaving her. "I don't see how they could be much worse, but thank you for defending my honor, misguided as it might have been." Henry's expression softened. Nothing misguided about it. No man should speak to a lady that way. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you have a plan for the bank payment?" "No," Josie admitted, the weight of her situation settling back on her shoulders. "But I couldn't let them see that." "We'll figure something out," Henry said with a conviction that made her want to believe him. "There's still time." That night, after a quiet supper during which both avoided mentioning the confrontation, Josie sat at her kitchen table long after Henry had returned to the barn. She spread out the farm's ledger, Thomas's hastily scrawled accounts revealing the extent of their debt. The amount needed to satisfy the bank was substantial, far more than could be raised by selling a few chickens or milk cows. A knock at the door startled her. Henry stood on the porch, his expression serious in the lamplight. "Thought you should know," he said without preamble. "I'm riding into San Diego tomorrow, have some business there that might help." "What kind of business?" Josie asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. "Better you don't know details yet." He must have seen the flicker of doubt cross her face, for he added quickly, "Nothing illegal, I promise you that, just something I need to settle." "How long will you be gone?" "2 days, maybe 3. Will you be all right here alone?" The concern in his voice touched her. "I managed alone before you came," she reminded him, though the prospect of his absence left her unexpectedly bereft. "That you did." A rare smile crossed his face. "You're stronger than you know, Josephine Shaw." Something in the way he said her name made her breath catch. "Be careful," she said softly. "Simon wasn't making idle threats. I can handle Simon Shaw and his kind." He tipped his hat slightly. "Get some rest. I'll be gone before sunrise, but I'll be back before you know it." True to his word, Henry was gone when Josie awoke the next morning. The barn felt emptier without his presence, the farm tasks lonelier without his companionship. She found herself looking up at every distant sound, hoping to see his dappled gray horse approaching even though she knew it was too soon. On the second day of his absence, Simon Shaw appeared at her door, this time alone. Josie considered not answering, but the insistent knocking suggested he wouldn't leave easily. "What do you want, Simon?" she asked through the barely opened door. "To make you an offer," he said, his manner less antagonistic than during their last encounter. "May I come in?" Reluctantly, Josie allowed him entry, keeping the kitchen table between them. Simon looked around the small house with an appraising eye. "Your farmhand seems to have moved on," he observed. "Can't say I'm surprised. Men like that never stay." "Mr. Dawson had business in San Diego," Josie corrected, though a small part of her feared Simon might be right. What if Henry didn't return? "He'll be back soon." Simon raised an eyebrow but didn't challenge her assertion. "I've been thinking about our situation, Josie. There's no need for things to be unpleasant between us. We're family after all." "What situation would that be?" she asked warily. "Your predicament with the bank." He settled into a chair without invitation. "I'm still willing to help despite your friend's behavior." "And what would this help cost me?" Simon's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing unreasonable. I'll pay your debt to the bank and you'll sign the farm over to me. You can continue living here, working the land as you have been. The only difference is you won't have to worry about foreclosure." "And I'd be what exactly? Your tenant, your employee?" "My sister-in-law," he said smoothly. "Family takes care of family. Thomas would want me to look after you." "Thomas abandoned me," Josie replied bluntly. "I doubt he's concerned about my welfare now." Simon's expression hardened slightly. "Be practical, Josie. You're a woman alone. Even with your drifter's help, you can't run this place. The town's talking. Your reputation is already compromised." "My reputation concerns me far less than my independence," she said, standing straighter. "The answer is no, Simon. I'll find another way." His facade of civility slipped, revealing the anger beneath. "There is no other way. By this time next week, the bank will own this farm, and I'll buy it from them anyway. The only difference is you'll have nowhere to go." "I believe I asked you to leave my property once before," Josie said, moving to the door and opening it wide. "The request still stands." Simon rose slowly, his eyes cold. "You'll regret this stubbornness, Josie. When your cowboy doesn't return and you're facing the streets alone, remember I offered you a way out." After he left, Josie sank into a chair, her hands shaking. The certainty in Simon's voice had planted a seed of doubt that took root despite her efforts to dislodge it. What if Henry had indeed moved on? He owed her nothing, after all. Their arrangement had been temporary from the start. The third day of Henry's absence dawned gray and threatening rain. Josie went about her chores mechanically, her thoughts divided between worry over the bank deadline and Henry's continued absence. By mid-afternoon, when dark clouds had gathered overhead but no rain had yet fallen, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded her at the sight of the dappled gray horse, but it quickly turned to concern when she realized Henry was slumped in the saddle. She ran to meet him as he dismounted stiffly, noticing immediately the bruising on his face and the way he favored his right side. What happened? She gasped, instinctively reaching toward him before catching herself. "Had a disagreement," he said grimly. "Nothing serious. You're hurt," she insisted, noting the dried blood on his shirt cuff. "Come inside, let me help you." In the kitchen, Henry lowered himself carefully into a chair while Josie heated water and gathered clean rags. He watched her movements with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "Your face is bruised," she said, bringing a basin of warm water to the table. "May I?" He nodded, sitting still as she gently cleaned a cut above his eyebrow. Up close, she could see that his right eye was swollen, the skin around it darkening to purple. His split lip had begun to heal but still looked painful. "Who did this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Doesn't matter." He winced slightly as she pressed a damp cloth to his cheekbone. "Got what I went for." Josie paused in her ministrations. "And what was that?" Henry reached into his coat with his uninjured hand and produced a leather pouch. It landed on the table with a weighty clink. "That," he said simply. She stared at the pouch, then at him. "What is it?" "Open it." With hesitant fingers, Josie untied the drawstring and tipped the contents onto the table. Gold coins spilled out more money than she had seen in one place since Thomas took their savings. She jerked back as if burned. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, sudden fear replacing concern. "Did you rob someone?" The hurt that flashed across Henry's battered face made her regret the accusation immediately. "No, madam," he said stiffly. "It's mine, earned honest. Been saving it these past few years." "Then why?" She stopped, understanding dawning. "You can't mean to give this to me." "That's exactly what I mean to do." He leaned forward despite his obvious discomfort. "It's enough to pay the bank and have some left over for seeds and supplies." Josie shook her head, overwhelmed by the gesture. "I can't accept this. It's too much. You don't even know me." "I know enough," Henry said quietly. "I know you're facing this town alone with more courage than most men I've ridden with. I know you work from sunup to sundown trying to save something that matters to you, and I know I want to help if you'll let me." Tears pricked at Josie's eyes. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Henry's gaze held hers, steady and certain. "Because sometimes a person just needs someone to stay when everyone else has left." The simplicity of his answer undid her. Tears spilled down her cheeks as weeks of fear, loneliness, and desperate strength finally overwhelmed her. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, needing an anchor in the storm of her emotions. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. "It's all right," he murmured. "You don't have to be strong every minute." They sat that way for some time, connected by clasped hands and shared silence. Eventually, Josie composed herself enough to ask, "Your injuries? They're because of the gold, aren't they?" Henry hesitated, then nodded. "Had it in a bank in San Diego. Banker wasn't keen on such a large withdrawal. Asked questions, made it difficult. Then some men followed me from the bank." His mouth quirked in a humorless smile. "They regretted that decision." "You could have been killed," Josie said, horrified anew at the risks he had taken. "All for a chance to help," he finished when she trailed off. "Worth it in my estimation." Josie looked at the gold coins gleaming on her table's salvation in metal form, then back at the bruised face of the man who had brought them to her. Something shifted in her heart, a recognition of something rare and precious that had nothing to do with gold. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "You don't need to." He squeezed her hand once before releasing it. "But I would appreciate if you'd finish patching me up. Got a few more scrapes that need tending." The next morning, Josie rode into town alone. The bank draft Henry had helped her prepare securely in her reticule. She wore her best dress, her hair neatly arranged beneath a modest hat. Whispers followed her progress down Julian's Main Street, but for once, she paid them no mind. Banker Whitfield's surprise at seeing her enter his office was evident in his raised eyebrows and momentary speechlessness. "Mrs. Shaw," he finally managed, "I wasn't expecting you until the end of the week." "I prefer to settle my debts promptly when possible," Josie replied, placing the bank draft on his desk with steady hands. "This should cover the mortgage payment in full with interest." Whitfield examined the draft, his expression cycling through disbelief to disappointment to resignation. "This appears to be in order," he acknowledged reluctantly, "though I must say I'm curious as to how you managed to secure such funds." "That's my concern, Mr. Whitfield." Josie smiled thinly. "Will there be anything else?" He cleared his throat, clearly thrown off balance by this turn of events. "No, I suppose not. Though I should warn you, Mrs. Shaw, one payment doesn't secure your future. There will be another due in 6 months. I'm well aware of my obligations, she assured him, rising to leave. Good day, Mr. Whitfield. As she stepped onto the boardwalk outside the bank, Josie nearly collided with Simon Shaw, whose expression darkened at the sight of her. Paying social calls, Josie, he asked sarcastically, or has the bank finally shown you the door? Neither, she replied, unable to keep a note of triumph from her voice. I've just paid my mortgage in full with interest. The farm remains mine. Simon's face contorted with disbelief and fury. Impossible, unless. His eyes narrowed. You're drifter. What did you have to do to get his money, Josie? What sort of arrangement have you made? The implication stung, but Josie refused to let him see it. Mr. Dawson is a friend who believes in helping neighbors in need, a concept you might want to familiarize yourself with, Simon. This isn't over, he hissed, echoing his parting words from their last encounter. That land should be in Shaw hands, the right Shaw hands. Your drifter won't stay forever, and when he's gone, you'll be alone again. Perhaps, Josie acknowledged, stepping around him. But I won't be desperate, and I won't be afraid. Good day, Simon. The walk back to the farm felt lighter than any journey Josie had made in weeks. The weight of impending disaster had lifted, replaced by cautious hope for the future. Fields that had seemed like burdens now appeared as possibilities. The house that had felt like a prison now welcomed her as a sanctuary. Henry was mending harness on the porch when she returned, his bruised face looking marginally better in daylight. He stood as she approached, searching her expression. It's done, she confirmed, smiling despite herself. The farm is safe. Relief crossed his features, followed by genuine pleasure. Good, that's good. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unasked questions about what came next. Josie was the first to break it. Your injuries, how do they feel today? Better, he said, though she noticed he still held himself carefully. Be right as rain in a few days. Another silence, heavier this time. Josie gathered her courage. When you're healed, will you be moving on? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither had yet voiced. Henry's blue eyes met hers, searching. Do you want me to go? He asked quietly. No, Josie admitted, the single syllable carrying more honesty than she had intended. But I have no right to ask you to stay either. You've done more than enough already. Henry set aside the harness he'd been working on and moved closer to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head to maintain eye contact. What if I want to stay? He asked, his voice low. What if I've found something here worth staying for? Josie's heart beat faster at his words, at the gentle intensity in his gaze. Henry, she began, unsure what she meant to say next. He waited, patient as always, giving her the space to find her words. When she remained silent, he spoke instead. I know it's too soon. You're still healing from what your husband did. I don't expect anything, Josie, but if you'll allow it, I'd like to stay and help with the farm, the rest. That can wait until you're ready, if ever. The simple honesty of his offer moved her deeply. This man, who had already given her so much, asked for nothing but permission to remain nearby. There was no pressure, no expectation, only a steadfast presence offering support. I'd like that, she whispered, surprising herself with how true the words felt. Henry's smile transformed his battered face, revealing the handsome man beneath the bruises. Then it's settled, he said, as if they'd just concluded the simplest of business arrangements rather than something that felt remarkably like a beginning. As spring gave way to summer, Henry's presence on the farm shifted from temporary arrangement to permanent fixture. He moved from the barn to a small room Josie had added to the back of the house years earlier for storage, giving him proper shelter while maintaining propriety. Together, they tended the growing crops, repaired long-neglected fences, and gradually transformed the struggling farm into a productive homestead. Word of their arrangement spread through Julian, of course. Some whispers persisted, but as time passed and the farm flourished, many of the townspeople who had turned their backs on Josie began to cautiously reconnect. The pastor's wife invited her to join the quilting circle again. The general store owner extended credit once more. Even banker Whitfield grudgingly acknowledged that her property was being well maintained. Only Simon Shaw maintained his hostility, glaring whenever they crossed paths in town and spreading rumors that grew increasingly desperate as they failed to gain traction. His wife Martha, however, surprised Josie by stopping her after church one Sunday in late July. "Josie," she said hesitantly, glancing around to ensure Simon was still engaged in conversation elsewhere. "I wanted to say, that is, I'm glad things are working out for you. The farm looks well." Taken aback by this unexpected olive branch, Josie could only nod. "Thank you, Martha." The woman twisted her gloves nervously. "Simon doesn't know I'm speaking to you. He's been difficult since Thomas left, had his heart set on combining your properties." "I gathered as much," Josie replied dryly. Martha's expression grew troubled. "Be careful, Josie. Simon doesn't take disappointment well. He talks, when he's been drinking, about your friend mostly. Ugly talk." A chill ran through Josie despite the summer heat. "Has he threatened specific action?" "Not in so many words." Martha glanced toward her husband, who was now looking in their direction with suspicion. "I should go. Just watch yourselves, that's all." She hurried away, leaving Josie with a sense of foreboding that lingered throughout the day. She related the conversation to Henry that evening as they sat on the porch after supper, a habit they had developed over the months. The twilight hour had become a sacred time for them, a pause between the day's labor and night's rest, when they could simply be together without the demands of work. Henry listened to her concerns without interruption, his expression thoughtful. "Not surprised," he finally said. "Man like Simon doesn't let go of grudges easy." Martha seemed genuinely worried, Josie pressed. "What if he's planning something? Then we'll deal with it." Henry's calm certainty was reassuring, as always. "But don't borrow trouble, Josie. The corn's coming in fine, the wheat's nearly ready for harvest, and we've got 3 new calves in the pasture. That's where our thoughts should be." Josie nodded, trying to absorb his practical approach. Over the months, she had come to rely on Henry's steadiness, his ability to face challenges without drama or despair. It balanced her own tendency toward worry, teaching her by example to focus on what could be done rather than what might go wrong. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the chorus of cicadas rising around them. Josie found herself studying Henry's profile in the fading light. The bruises from his San Diego trip had long since healed, revealing the strong lines of his face. He had trimmed his beard that morning, and his hair was neatly combed back from his forehead. He looked settled, content a far cry from the weathered drifter who had ridden up to her fence line months ago. As if feeling her gaze, Henry turned to meet it, a question in his eyes. Josie felt her cheeks warm, but didn't look away. Something had been building between them all summer, an unspoken connection that grew stronger with each passing day. They hadn't put it into words, both seemingly content to let it develop at its own pace, but Josie found herself increasingly aware of his presence, attuned to his movements, thoughts of him intruding when they were apart. "Penny for your thoughts," Henry said softly, breaking the silence. Josie smiled. "I was just thinking how different everything is from when you first arrived. The farm, the town's attitude, me. You haven't changed," Henry replied. "You're the same brave woman I met that first day. Difference is, now you believe it too." His perception touched her deeply. "I never properly thanked you," she said impulsively. "Not just for the money, but for staying, for helping me find my feet again." "No thanks needed," Henry assured her, though his eyes warmed at her words. "Being here, working alongside you. It's given me something I've been searching for since the war, purpose, a place that feels right." The vulnerability in his admission made Josie's heart swell. She reached out, covering his hand with hers where it rested on the porch rail. "I'm glad you found it here," she whispered. Henry turned his hand beneath hers, their palms meeting, fingers intertwining. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through Josie's body, a physical acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing between them. They stayed that way for a long moment, holding hands in the darkness, neither speaking for fear of breaking the spell. Then, with gentle deliberation, Henry lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, a gesture so tender it brought tears to Josie's eyes. "It's getting late," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We should turn in. Harvest starts tomorrow." Josie nodded, reluctantly allowing him to release her hand. "Good night, Henry," she said, her own voice barely audible. "Good night, Josie," he replied, the way he said her name making it sound like a caress. That night, lying in her bed listening to the reassuring sounds of Henry moving about in his room, Josie acknowledged to herself what her heart had known for some time. She was falling in love with Henry Dawson. The realization brought both joy and trepidation. Joy at finding such a good man after the bitter disappointment of her marriage, trepidation at the vulnerability that came with loving again. Thomas's betrayal had left scars that were only beginning to heal. Could she trust her judgment this time? Was she seeing Henry clearly, or merely the salvation he represented? And what of her status as a married woman abandoned but not divorced? These questions circled in her mind, tempering her happiness with caution. The wheat harvest kept them both too busy for private conversations over the next several days. They worked from dawn until dusk, cutting, bundling, and threshing alongside two local boys Josie had hired with part of the money Henry had brought from San Diego. The physical labor left little energy for anything but exhausted sleep. Yet Josie found herself hyper-aware of Henry's presence, the brush of his arm against hers, as they worked side by side, the encouragement in his smile when she straightened from a particularly difficult task, the quiet pride in his eyes as they surveyed their accomplishments each evening. On the final day of harvest, as they stored the last of the grain in the newly repaired barn, a rider approached the farm. Josie recognized the sheriff's dun horse before she could make out the man himself. Her heart raced with sudden anxiety. Law enforcement rarely brought good news in her experience. Sheriff Miller dismounted with a nod of greeting. "Mrs. Shaw," he said, his weathered face unreadable beneath his mustache. "Mr. Dawson, fine-looking harvest you've got." "Thank you, Sheriff," Josie replied, wiping dusty hands on her apron. "What brings you out this way?" The lawman's expression turned uncomfortable. "Got some news I thought you should hear directly from me rather than town gossip." He glanced between them. "It's about Thomas Shaw." Josie felt Henry move closer to her side, his silent support steadying her. "What about him?" she asked, her voice remarkably even. "He's dead," Sheriff Miller said bluntly. "Got word from the authorities in Sacramento yesterday. Seems he got himself shot in a gambling dispute about a month back." The news hit Josie like a physical blow. Despite everything Thomas had done, despite the anger and hurt he had caused, she had never wished him dead. She had imagined confronting him someday, demanding explanations, perhaps even finding closure. That possibility was gone now, leaving only questions that would never be answered. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Shaw," the sheriff continued awkwardly. "Thought you had a right to know." "Thank you for telling me," Josie managed. Did he leave anything? A message, perhaps?" Sheriff Miller shook his head. "Nothing I know of, just the notification of death." He hesitated, then added, "There is one other matter. Simon Shaw is claiming that as Thomas's only living relative, he has rights to this property now." Beside her, Henry stiffened. "That's not how the law works," he said, his voice hard. "Mrs. Shaw owns this farm in her own right." "That's my understanding as well," the sheriff agreed. "But Simon's been talking to a lawyer in San Diego. Thought you should be prepared in case he tries something formal." After the sheriff departed, Josie stood motionless in the yard, trying to process the news. Thomas was dead. The husband who had promised to build a life with her, who had shared her bed and her dreams before abandoning both, was gone forever. She waited for tears, for grief, for some emotional response that would make sense of the hollow feeling in her chest. "Josie," Henry said gently, drawing her attention back to the present. "Come, sit down. You're pale." He guided her to the porch steps, his hand warm at the small of her back. They sat side by side, the setting sun painting the farmyard in golden light that seemed at odds with the somber news. "I don't know what to feel," Josie admitted after a long silence. "I thought I hated him for what he did, but I never wanted this." "Of course you didn't," Henry said, his voice gentle. "You're not made that way." She looked at him gratefully, touched by his understanding. It feels strange. Being a widow in truth now, all these months I've been in limbo, not a wife in any real sense, but not free either. Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. And now, Josie considered the question, turning it over in her mind. Now I suppose I have clarity, at least, a chance to truly start again. Something flickered in Henry's eyes at her words, hope, perhaps, or uncertainty. He seemed about to speak when the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Looking up, Josie saw Simon Shaw riding toward the farm, accompanied by a man she didn't recognize. "Speak of the devil," Henry muttered, rising to his feet. Josie stood beside him, steeling herself for the confrontation. Simon dismounted with a dramatic flourish, his companion following more sedately. "Josephine," he called, his voice carrying a false note of sympathy, "I've just heard the tragic news. My dear brother taken so young." "Sheriff Miller already informed me," Josie replied coolly. "My condolences on your loss as well." Simon waved away her words. "Family must come together in times of grief. This is Mr. Hargrove, my attorney. He's here to discuss the transfer of property." The lawyer, a thin man with spectacles perched on a beak-like nose, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Shaw, in the absence of a will and given your husband's death intestate, his brother has certain claims to this farm belongs to Mrs. Shaw," Henry interrupted, his stance protective without being threatening. "Thomas Shaw abandoned it and his wife months ago. She's maintained it alone, paid the mortgage alone, and harvested the crops alone. The law recognizes her ownership." Mr. Hargrove peered at Henry over his spectacles. "And you are?" "Henry Dawson. I work for Mrs. Shaw." Simon laughed, the sound ugly with derision. "Work, is it? Is that what they're calling it these days? The whole town knows what kind of work you've been doing, drifter." Josie stepped forward, anger displacing shock. "That's enough, Simon. You will not speak that way on my property. Whatever claim you think you have, you're mistaken. Thomas left nothing but debts, which I have paid. The farm is mine." "We'll see about that," Simon sneered. "The judge might have a different view once he hears how quickly you replaced my brother in your bed." Henry moved so quickly Josie barely saw it happen. One moment he was beside her, the next he had Simon by the collar, his face inches from the other man's. "I warned you once about speaking to her with respect," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "I won't warn you again." The lawyer stumbled backward, alarmed by the sudden violence. Simon's face had gone white, his bravado evaporating in the face of Henry's controlled anger. "Threaten me all you want," Simon gasped, his voice strained by Henry's grip. "It won't change the law." "Henry," Josie said softly, touching his arm, "let him go, he's not worth it." After a tense moment, Henry released Simon, who staggered back, straightening his collar with shaking hands. "This isn't over," he spat, the familiar refrain now tinged with genuine fear. "Come, Hargrove, we'll let the court settle this." They watched the two men ride away, Simon's posture rigid with humiliation. When they were out of sight, Josie turned to Henry, concern evident in her expression. "He'll be back with the law," she said quietly. "Sheriff Miller may understand our situation, but a judge from San Diego might see things differently." Henry's jaw was set, his eyes still following the direction the men had gone. "We'll fight it," he said simply. "I know a good lawyer in Sacramento. Helped me with some mining claims years back. I'll write to him tonight." The confidence in his voice steadied her. "You keep surprising me," Josie said, a small smile finding its way to her lips despite the circumstances. "Mining claims. What else don't I know about you, Henry Dawson?" His expression softened as he looked at her. "Nothing important. I've been many things in my life, soldier, miner, ranch hand. None of it matters much compared to being here now." The simple honesty of his statement touched Josie deeply. In that moment, with the golden light of sunset illuminating his features and the certainty of his support surrounding her, she made a decision. Stepping closer, she placed her hands on his chest, feeling his heart beat strong and steady beneath her palm. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered, rising on tiptoes to press her lips gently against his. The kiss was brief, a whisper of contact that nonetheless sent warmth cascading through her body. When she pulled back, Henry's eyes had darkened, his expression a mixture of surprise and something deeper, more elemental. "Josie," he breathed, her name a question and a prayer. I know it's complicated, she said quickly, with Thomas only just, and Simon's threats and what people might say. But I've been hiding from how I feel and I don't want to anymore. Life's too uncertain to waste time being afraid. Henry's hands came up to frame her face, his touch impossibly gentle. Are you sure? He asked, searching her eyes. I can wait, Josie. I'd wait as long as you needed. The tenderness in his voice nearly undid her. I'm sure, she whispered. I think I've been sure since the day you sat in silence and promised to stay when everyone else had left. His smile then was like the breaking of dawn, slow, radiant, transformative. He leaned down, kissing her with a thoroughness that left no doubt of his feelings. Josie's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer, reveling in the solid warmth of him against her. When they finally parted, both breathless, the sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving them in the gathering twilight. I love you, Josephine Shaw, Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. Have since that first week, I think, watching you fight for this place with everything you had. Joy bubbled up in Josie's chest, effervescent and healing. I love you too, she replied, the words both foreign and familiar on her tongue. More than I thought I could love anyone again. They stood together in the deepening darkness, the future uncertain but no longer frightening. Whatever Simon might try, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. For the first time since Thomas's betrayal, Josie felt truly whole, not because Henry had rescued her, but because loving him had helped her rescue herself. The following weeks brought both challenges and joys. True to his word, Henry wrote to his lawyer friend in Sacramento, who responded with encouraging news. As Thomas's abandoned wife who had maintained the property in his absence, Josie had a strong legal claim to the farm. The fact that she had paid the mortgage herself further strengthened her position. Simon, meanwhile, continued his campaign to claim the property. He filed formal papers with the county court, necessitating a hearing that would take place in early September. The prospect of a legal battle added stress to an already busy season as they prepared for the corn harvest and apple picking in the small orchard behind the house. Yet despite these worries, Josie found herself happier than she had been in years. Her relationship with Henry deepened daily, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose that her marriage to Thomas had never achieved. They maintained separate sleeping arrangements, mindful of proprieties even as their hearts grew increasingly entwined, but spent every waking moment in a partnership that felt more intimate than any physical connection. The town's attitude toward them underwent a gradual transformation as well. Those who had shunned Josie now greeted her warmly at church or in the general store. The pastor, once standoffish, stopped by the farm to offer his services should she and Henry wish to marry once her status as a widow was officially recognized. Even banker Whitfield, impressed by the farm's increasing productivity, suggested they might discuss expanding their operation with a loan for additional livestock. Only Simon and his closest allies maintained their hostility, though Martha Shaw continued to offer quiet words of support when their paths crossed. He's drinking more, she confided to Josie after church one Sunday in late August, making threats. I've tried to reason with him, but he won't listen. Has he said what he plans to do? Josie asked, concerned by the shadows beneath Martha's eyes. Nothing specific, just that he'll see justice done, whatever it takes. Martha glanced toward where Simon stood talking with several men from town. Be careful, both of you, especially at night. The warning left Josie uneasy, and she related it to Henry as they drove home in their wagon. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly grave. I'll start keeping the rifle closer, he said when she finished. And perhaps we should consider getting a dog good for herding and for warning. Josie nodded, appreciating his practical response to a threat that remained frustratingly vague. The hearing is only 2 weeks away, she said. Surely he wouldn't do anything foolish with legal proceedings pending. Men like Simon don't always think clearly when pride's involved, Henry replied, his eyes scanning the road ahead and the fields to either side with new vigilance. But don't worry overmuch. We'll be ready for whatever comes. That night, as they sat together on the porch after supper, the harvest moon rising full and golden over the eastern hills, Henry took Josie's hand in his. "Been meaning to ask you something," he said, his usual confidence tempered by an endearing nervousness. "What is it?" Josie prompted. When he fell silent, Henry cleared his throat. "After the hearing, once things are settled legally, I was wondering if you might consider making our arrangement more permanent." Josie's heart skipped. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Not doing a very good job of it, am I?" He turned to face her fully, still holding her hand. "Josephine Shaw, when the time is right, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had hoped for this, had even imagined it in quiet moments when allowing herself to dream of the future, the reality of his proposal filled Josie with a happiness so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered, then more firmly, "yes, I would love that more than anything." Henry's smile bloomed fully, transforming his face. "I don't have a ring yet," he admitted. "Wanted to be sure of your answer first." "I don't need a ring," Josie assured him, squeezing his hand. "Just your promise." "You have that," he said solemnly. "Have had it since the day I told you I would stay." He kissed her then, a kiss that sealed their commitment and spoke of all the days to come. When they parted, both breathless and smiling, the future seemed to stretch before them like the moonlit fields full of possibility and promise. The sound of a rifle shot shattered the moment, the bullet splintering wood inches from Henry's head. Without hesitation, he tackled Josie to the porch floor, covering her body with his as a second shot rang out. "Stay down," he ordered, his voice calm despite the danger. "Crawl inside when I move." "Not without you," Josie protested, heart pounding with fear not for herself but for him. "I'll be right behind you," he promised. "On my count, 1, 2, 3, they scrambled for the door as another shot kicked up splinters near Josie's feet. Once inside, Henry immediately doused the lamp, plunging the house into darkness. "The rifle," he said, moving with surprising stealth to the corner where his weapon stood. "It's Simon, isn't it?" Josie whispered, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. "Most likely." Henry checked the rifle's loading with practiced hands. "Stay away from the windows, I'm going out the back." "No," Josie grabbed his arm. "You can't go out there, he'll kill you." "He'll have to be a better shot than he's shown so far," Henry replied grimly. "I won't let him threaten us in our own home." The determination in his voice made clear that argument was futile. Instead, Josie pressed a quick kiss to his lips. "Be careful," she pleaded. "I can't lose you now." Henry's expression softened momentarily. "You won't," he assured her. "But if I'm not back in 10 minutes, fire the shotgun out the window to bring help." After he slipped out the back door, Josie retrieved the shotgun from above the fireplace and positioned herself where she could watch both the front door and the window facing the barn. The silence stretched, broken only by her own rapid breathing and the pounding of her heart. 1 minute passed, then 5. No more shots sounded, which she tried to take as a good sign. Just as she was about to fire the shotgun into the air as Henry had instructed, she heard footsteps on the back porch. She swung around, weapon raised, only to lower it in relief as Henry's familiar silhouette appeared in the doorway. "It's clear," he said, setting his rifle aside. "Found signs that someone was hiding in the trees near the road, but they're gone now." "Did you see who it was?" Josie asked, setting down the shotgun with shaking hands. "Too dark," Henry admitted, "but I found this." He held up a flask engraved with initials that caught the moonlight streaming through the window. SS. "Simon Shaw, liquid courage, I'd guess." Josie sank into a chair, the adrenaline of fear giving way to trembling aftermath. "He really tried to kill us." "Or scare us badly," Henry said, kneeling before her and taking her hands in his. "Either way, we're reporting this to Sheriff Miller first thing tomorrow. A man who shoots at his own family won't find much sympathy, even among his friends." That night, despite Henry's assurances that Simon was unlikely to return, they both slept poorly. Josie insisted Henry take the spare room rather than the barn, propriety be damned under the circumstances. They left a lamp burning low, rifles within reach, and woke at every creak and rustle of the old farmhouse. Morning brought no further incidents but a grim determination to seek justice. They rode into town together, the flask safely wrapped in Henry's saddlebag as evidence. Sheriff Miller listened to their account with growing concern, examining the flask with its damning initials. "This is serious," he acknowledged, setting the flask on his desk. "Attempted murder, no two ways about it. I'll ride out to Simon's place now and bring him in." "Be careful," Henry warned. "He was shooting wild last night. No telling what state of mind he's in today." The sheriff nodded, strapping on his gun belt with deliberate movements. "You two stay in town until I send word. No sense putting yourselves in danger if he slips away from me." They spent an anxious day in Julian, accepting the hospitality of the pastor and his wife, who insisted they join them for lunch after hearing a sanitized version of events. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns, and by mid-afternoon, a steady stream of concerned neighbors had stopped by to express their support. "Never did like Simon Shaw," declared Mrs. Hollister, the baker's wife. "Always putting on airs like he was better than the rest of us. Not surprised he'd turn violent when things didn't go his way." "Thomas was the same underneath," added her husband. "Just hit it better. No offense meant, Mrs. Shaw." "None taken," Josie assured him, finding it easier than expected to hear her former husband's character assessed honestly. "I've had time to see things clearly now." It was nearly sunset when Sheriff Miller's deputy arrived with news. Simon Shaw had been arrested without incident at his home, found half drunk and still in possession of the rifle used in the shooting. He was now in the town jail awaiting transport to San Diego for trial. "The sheriff says you can return home safely," the young deputy informed them. "Though he suggests keeping your doors locked for a few days, just to be certain." That night, back at their farm, Josie and Henry sat together on the repaired porch step, the events of the past 24 hours giving new meaning to the simple pleasure of being home and safe. "What happens now?" Josie asked, leaning against Henry's solid shoulder. "Simon will stand trial for attempted murder," he replied. "With the evidence and our testimony, he'll likely go to prison for a good long while. And Martha, what will happen to her?" Henry considered this. "That would be her choice. She could sell their place, go back to family if she has any. Or stay and run it herself like you did." Josie nodded thoughtfully. "I should talk to her, offer help if she wants it." "You've a generous heart, Josie Shaw," Henry said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "One of the many reasons I love you." 2 weeks later, they attended the hearing regarding Josie's claim to the farm. With Simon in jail and Henry's lawyer friend presenting a strong case, the outcome was never really in doubt. The judge, a no-nonsense man from San Diego, ruled firmly in Josie's favor, citing her continuous maintenance of the property and payment of debts after Thomas's abandonment. "Furthermore," he added, peering at Josie over his spectacles, "the court recognizes your status as widow of Thomas Shaw, entitling you to all rights and privileges thereof, including the right to remarry should you so choose." Outside the courthouse, under a September sky of perfect blue, Henry lifted Josie off her feet in an exuberant embrace that drew smiles from passers-by. "It's over," he said as he set her down gently. "The farm is yours, free and clear." "Ours," Josie corrected, reaching up to touch his face. "If the offer still stands." Henry's smile was answer enough, but he put it into words nonetheless. "It stands firmer than ever. Josephine Shaw, will you marry me?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation, "as soon as it can be arranged." They were married 2 weeks later in the small white church in Julian, with half the town in attendance. The pastor spoke of new beginnings and enduring love, themes that resonated deeply with both bride and groom. Josie wore a simple dress of pale blue, a deliberate choice to distinguish this wedding from her first, and carried wildflowers gathered from their own fields that morning. Martha Shaw, looking years younger without her husband's oppressive presence, attended with her sister from Los Angeles, who had come to help her settle her affairs. After the ceremony, she approached the newlyweds with tears in her eyes. "I'm so happy for you both," she said, embracing Josie warmly. "You deserve this happiness after everything Simon put you through. What will you do now?" Josie asked gently. Martha smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her usually careworn face. I'm selling the farm to that nice German family that just moved to town, going to live with my sister in Los Angeles. Always wanted to see the ocean every day. That sounds wonderful, Josie said sincerely. Please write and let us know how you're settling in. As Martha moved away to congratulate other guests, Henry slipped his arm around Josie's waist. Mrs. Dawson, he murmured, the name still new and wonderful to her ears. Ready to go home, Josie leaned into his embrace, savoring the solid warmth of him beside her. Home, she repeated, the word carrying all the promise of their shared future. Yes, I'm ready. They left the church amid cheers and well wishes, riding in a wagon decorated with ribbons and flowers by the local children. The autumn sun bathed Julian in golden light as they made their way back to the farm, their farm now, truly and legally shared between them. That evening, as darkness fell on their first day as husband and wife, they stood together on the porch where they had weathered gunfire and made promises. The harvest moon hung low and full in the eastern sky, casting long shadows across fields that now stood empty of crops but full of possibility for the seasons to come. "What are you thinking?" Henry asked, his arms encircling her from behind as they gazed out at their land. Josie leaned back against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her shoulders. "I'm thinking about the day you rode up to my fence, how desperate I was, how alone I felt. And now," his voice was soft against her hair, "now I'm thinking that sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "That losing everything can make room for something greater than you ever imagined." Henry's eyes, bright even in the moonlight, held hers with an intensity that still made her breath catch. "I told you I would stay," he said simply. "It's the easiest promise I've ever kept. And I'll hold you to it," Josie replied, rising on tiptoes to kiss him, "for all the days to come." As their lips met, sealing this latest promise among many they had made and would make to each other, Josie knew with bone-deep certainty that this was where she belonged, not just on this land that she had fought to keep, but in the arms of this man who had taught her that true love wasn't about grand gestures or pretty words, but about choosing to stay when staying was hard, about building something enduring together one day at a time. The years that followed brought challenges, as all years do, but also joys beyond measure. The farm prospered under their joint care, expanding to include more livestock and crops. Their family grew as well, first with a son they named James, born exactly 1 year after their wedding, then with twin daughters, Sarah and Elizabeth, who arrived 2 years later to general astonishment and delight. Simon Shaw served 8 years in San Diego prison for attempted murder before being released and promptly leaving California for parts unknown. Thomas's body was eventually returned to Julian at Josie's request and buried in the town cemetery with a simple marker closure for a chapter of her life that had ended long before his death. The town of Julian grew and changed with the passing decades. The gold that had originally drawn settlers eventually played out, but the rich soil and favorable climate encouraged many to stay and farm instead. Henry and Josie's farm became known for its fine apples, and later, for the pies that Josie began selling in town, the beginning of a tradition that would outlast them both. Through it all, they remained each other's steadfast companions, their love deepening with shared joys and weathered sorrows. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work complete, they would often sit together on the porch where their story had truly begun, hands clasped, watching the stars emerge above the land they both loved. "Do you ever wonder," Josie asked on one such evening, her head resting on Henry's shoulder, silver now threading through both their hair, "what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day, if you'd ridden on past our farm?" Henry considered this, his thumb tracing absent patterns on her palm. "No," he finally said, the certainty in his voice unchanged after all their years together. "Some things are meant to be, Josie. I was always going to stop. You were always going to let me stay." "And this," He gestured to their home, their land. The evidence of their shared life was always waiting for us to build it together. Josie smiled, knowing he was right. Out of abandonment had come belonging, out of betrayal, the truest love she had ever known. And it had all begun with a drifter who had sat in silence and said the words that had changed everything. "I will stay."